So we're continuing our study now, our overview of the avodos, special avoda of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim. And we have the Ketores that was brought on a daily basis. Half of it was brought in the morning and half Bein Arbayim. And now on Yom Kippurim, there's an additional Ketores with a special avoda of Yom Kippurim. And that requires what's called Chatias HaGecholim Mimizbeach HaChitzon. So it means the following. There's an additional Ketores, a special Ketores for Yom Kippurim. And it required what's called Shchika Daka Min Hadaka. An additional Shchika to crush the Samamonim of the Ketores, Daka al Daka, much more than they would do during the course of the year. Okay? So this Shchika Nosefes was done in the following way. After they shechted the paro shel Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Gadol then took a machta of gecholim from the daily ketores of the whole year round, which he also did on Yom Kippur. And this machta was like a little shovel, and he would fill up this shovel with gecholim, with the coals from the ketores, and then he climbed up to the mizbeach, meaning he went up to kevesh. And we're talking now about the Mizbeach HaChitzon in the Azara. And after he filled up this machta with gecholim by digging the pan, or the shovel, if you want to call it, into the gecholim, this was on a maracha miuchedes. There was a special fire that was burning, and it was located Bitzido Hamaravi Shalom Mizbeach. It was on the western side of the Mizbeach, and that maracha was set up for the purpose of this chatia, of digging the pan of the gecholim for the ketores of Yom Kippur. And at this point, he would put the machta down in the Azara, because again, we're talking about the Mizbeach HaChitzon, which is located in the Azara. He's doing the chitui of the gecholim in the maracha that's on the side, shall we call it the western side of the Mizbeach? And right now, that's where he puts it down. That's where it remains. Okay. Now, he takes the gecholim out of the Mizbeach HaChitzon. This is derived from the pasuk in Achrimos. It says, "V'lakach melo hamachta gachle eish me'al Mizbeach lifnei Hashem." And the Gemara in Masechta Yoma darshins this pasuk: "Ezu Mizbeach shemiktsasa lifnei Hashem v'ein kulo lifnei Hashem hevi omer zeh Mizbeach HaChitzon." So when the pasuk says "mi lifnei Hashem," it refers to a mizbeach that's partially lifnei Hashem, which is called miktsaso lifnei Hashem, but it's not kulo lifnei Hashem. And why do we identify that mizbeach as the mizbeach hachitzon? Because if the Torah had to tell me that he's taking from the mizbeach that's lifnei Hashem, why did the Torah have to tell me that? I mean, it says me'al mizbeach. The Mizbeach is Lifnei Hashem. What's this? Me'al HaMizbeach mi Lifnei Hashem. There's got to be some emphasis here. So again, Mikach shetzorach hakosav lamdeinu sheyitol dafka mi Lifnei Hashem af shekvar kosav me'al HaMizbeach. So it says me'al HaMizbeach. We know that that's Lifnei Hashem. What's the addition of Lifnei Hashem? Array, it must mean that he can take from the Mizbeach in a place that's not Lifnei Hashem. And the Torah is telling me that that means he takes from the Chelek Maravi Shalom Mizbeach. That's where they had the special Marach on the western side of the Mizbeach. And that western side of the Mizbeach, because again, you enter into the Mikdash through the east, and as you travel west, you're getting closer and closer to the Kodesh Kodshim, and obviously to the Heichal and the Kodesh Kodshim. And therefore, we're not talking about the Mizbeach HaPnimi. The Mizbeach HaPnimi is inside the Heichal. That's Kula Lifnei Hashem. And here, Milifnei Hashem implies that it's partially Lifnei Hashem and partially not. Which Mizbeach are we talking about? We're talking about the Mizbeach HaChitzon in the Azara. And it's partially Lifnei Hashem, meaning the western side, as we go to the end of the Mizbeach, that end of the Mizbeach is close to the Kodesh Kodashim. And that's considered like it's Miktas Lifnei Hashem. So therefore, the Machta of Gecholim is taken from the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Okay? Now, we said that the first stage in the process of the special Haktoras of Yom Kippur is the Chatiyah, when he digs the pan in to remove the Gecholim. Rav Papa, in Masechta Yoma, on Daf Memches, vacillates back and forth. Chatiyas Gecholim Mau. What's the status of this act of Chatiyas HaGecholim, to get the Gecholim into the Machta? Machshirei mitzvah, uke mitzvah dami, o lo. He seems to have a suffix as to whether or not the Chatiyah itself is called an avoda. And that's nogea to what's called pigul, machshavas pigul. If, let's say, for example, at the moment of Chatiyas Gecholim, if I define it and classify it as an avoda, he had in mind a machshavas pigul, then these Gecholim become possible midin pigul. And that, in fact, is the opinion of an entire school of Rishonim, that when Rav Papa vacillated back and forth as to whether or not Chatiyas Gecholim is machshirei mitzvah k'mitzvah or lo, what he meant to say was that if machshirei mitzvah k'mitzvah applies to Chatiyas HaGecholim, then Chatiyas HaGecholim is elevated to the status of an avoda, and therefore, if he had a machshavas pigul at the time, at the moment of Chatiyas Gecholim, then the Gecholim become possible. And this means that, and this is the Shita Tosfos, that we're not talking about pigul generating a chiyuv kares. Normally, pigul means that if there's a machshavas pigul, then the basar, if you eat it, you're chayiv kares. See, we're talking about gecholim now. But rather, the ketores is considered something which is ein lahem matirim. In other words, it's not like dam of karbonos, where after the zrikas hadam, you still need the ketores murim and the achilas habasar. There's a whole series of matirim. But rather, we classify ketores as ein lahem matirim. There's nothing else that's matir then. And therefore, there's no chiyuv kares for pigul. But when we say that there's a psul of pigul, we mean that there's only a psul, there's no chiyuv, which normally for creating pigul is a chiyuv kares. Here there's no chiyuv kares because it's ein lahem matirim, but it passes the avoda, in this case, the gecholim. However, the other tzad in Rav Papa is ein avoda v'ein mefaglin ba. This is not Chatiyas HaGecholim. It's not called an avoda. Therefore, there's no machshavas pigul aposelos. That's one school of thought in the Rishonim. That's the Balei HaTosfos here in Masechta Yom. Rashi actually quotes two Perushim, and the first Perush is the one that we just presented now. He says, according to one Perush in Rashi, we have another interpretation, and that is that the suffix of Papa is in a case where at the time of Chatias HaGecholim, he had a machshavas pigul on the Ketores itself, which means the following: that Rav Papa vacillated about Chatias Gecholim. Is it considered the beginning and the first stage of the avoda, the Ketores? And what happens after the pan, the machta is filled with gecholim, then we have something called chafina. Chafina is when the Kohen Gadol is going to have to dig in to the gecholim. And therefore, if he has a machshava of pigul at the moment of chatias hagecholim, which according to one side of Rav Papa is considered a tchilas avoda, which is going to culminate with chafinas hagecholim, then that itself passes the avoda. So just like a machshava of pigul passes b'shas chafina, so too, if we hold that chatia is tchilas avoda, then a machshavas pigul passes even at the moment of chatias hagachon. Oh, she'ena chatia chelik me'avodas hachafina. It's only a kind of a machshir. Obviously he has to do the chatia before he gets to the chafina to get the gecholim onto the machta. The enak toris nifseles at the moment of chatia, if he has a machshavas pigul, it would not passel the Torres because it's not considered the beginning of the avodah of chafina, and the only machshava poselis of pigul would be b'shas chafina. So basically, according to all Rishonim, the suffix of Papa is whether or not we upgrade the status of chatia to that of an avodah. The two versions in the Rishonim is that one version, once we upgrade it to the status of the avoda, then for sure there would be a machshavas pigul aposelas. In other words, it was never an issue according to the first interpretation as to the relationship between chatia and chafina. The only issue was how to define and classify the chatia itself. So that school of thought in the Rishonim, which we attributed to the Balei HaTosfos, the suffix of Papa, simply breaks down to one question only: does chatia have the status of an avoda? And the nafkamin is whether machshavas pigul will pass. The second sheet in the Rishonim holds that no, the issue in Rav Papa's mind was not about the status of chatia, but rather about the relation between chatia and chafina. Do we view the chatia as part and parcel of the avoda, the chafina? We know that this machshava posel b'shas chafina. Do we start the chafina with chatia, insofar as chatia is what facilitates chafina? It sets up the chafina. Okay. Now, let's talk a little about chafina. He places the machta after he did the chatia with the gecholim in it, and hotzio min alishkos es hakaf. In other words, there was a kaf. Until now, we've been discussing the machta. Now we're switching over to a kaf, which is a spoon. And he puts the ketores, the special ketores of Yom Kippurim, he puts into the kaf. and he brings it into the Kodesh HaKadosh. So that's the kaf that has in it part of the Ketores. Now he has the machta for the Ketores. The machta's foot is filled with gecholim, with coals, and chifein min hamachta b'shtei yadav melo chafnav. Now he digs into the machta to take out 2 full handfuls of gecholim, kakosav, like the pasuk says, umelo chafnav ketores samim daka vevi v'beis laparochas. So after he does the chafina, now he's ready to take those gecholim and put them into the kaf. Now the Torah says malo chafnav. Malo chafnav is subjective. And I think we discussed this in Masechta Erev, if I'm not mistaken. And it means that if the Kohen Gadol has large hands, then his malo chafnav respectively is large. If on the other hand, the Kohen Gadol is smaller, so then the amount of the chafina of Ketores is going to be smaller. Number 2, the shear is eno begadush harbe v'lo b'machuk el begova ma'at memale chafna. So it shouldn't be overflowing. It shouldn't be a small amount. It should be a little bit higher than malo chafnav. So he's got malo chafnav, and it rises a little bit above his hands. Next, ose esachafina kiderech hanoshim achofnim chetochev sida asmolis shel yodo hayeminis kishekaf yodo litzad maila litoch haktores v'chofen v'chein osa biyodo asmolis keneged yad zu umolech hayadayim zu keneged zu v'sogram kishehem b'toch haktores. Wow, this is so complicated. He has to dig his hands into the machta backwards, meaning upside down. Shetochev kishekaf yodo litzad mala. I know. What did I say? I said upside down. Kaf yodo litzad mala. So he digs in his fingers into the ketores, v'chofen. And he does this with each one of his hands. So what does it mean? Sometimes the language is very confusing. He says, Sida hasmolis shel yodo hayeminis. For some reason, he is digging this way, on the left side with his right hand, and v'chein osa biyad hasmolis, which would be the right side of his left hand. You follow what I mean? So he's able to scoop up the ketores. Molech hayadayim zu keneged zu v'sogram ksheim b'toch haketores, and all this he's doing while his hands are still submerged in the ketores. And if he doesn't do the chafin in that way, the Gemara has a suffix whether or not he has fulfilled the mitzvah of chafin. Next, tzorach sheyechvon bi'atzmo es haketores, o afim chafan kohen acher v'nosan l'tok yodov harezu chafina. What is chafina? Does chafina mean digging his hands into the ketores, or having the ketores in his hands? The nafkamina is whether another kohen can do the actual chafina and then put the ketores into his hands. Sharei nimtza biyodo ktores v'lo chafna. It's not the Maisa Chafina, but the result, as long as he's got the Torres in Malo Chafna. So that's a suffix in the Gemara. Another suffix in the Gemara, Im Yochel Lasos Mido Lechafina, Shechofe Bekli Hamadud Lefi Chafnov, O Shechafina Muri Dafka Biyodov. The question is, can he do the Chafina with a Kli, holding on to a receptacle, or does it have to be directly with his hands? So this is a whole slew of sfekos that the Gemara vacillates back and forth about the chafina. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there's a halach of machsheves pigul at the time of the chafina. And once again, the Gemara vacillates about the machsheves pigul at the moment of chafina, which passes the Torres. According to some Rishonim, Chafinas haktores eina doma legamrei lekmitas menachos uleshchita mizvachim. We had assumed that just like there's a halacha of shchita in zvachim and kmitza menachos, so too there's chafina in ktores, and therefore there's machsheves pigul aposelis. He says, "Harei bahem hu mevar ba'avodaso as chelik hagavoa michelik ha-hejot." So we're going to do a shchit on the carbon and separate the dam from the rest of the carbon. In menachos, we're going to separate the komets from the rest of the mincha. Mashenkim chafina, af shenishar b'machte, even that which is left in the machte, maktirin also l'macha. In other words, there will be a haktorah, not just on that part that is in his hands that he was chofin, but even on that which is left in the machta, that also requires haktorah. So when the Gemara vacillates back and forth about the machshavas pigul at the time of chafina, whether it is a machshava poselis or not, that's because chafina is different than shchita in zvachim and kmitza in menachos. Yesh min harisham shenoktu shalom askonas haGemara. The final conclusion of the Gemara is that machshava poselis b'chafina. That's what we were assuming until now. And yesh also shalom askona arba avodos b'ktores. That just like there are 4 avodos in zvachim, there are 4 avodos in ktores. Chafina, which is parallel to shchita in tvachim or kmitza in menachos. Kabbalas hakaf keneged kabbalas hadam v'komets hamincha b'klishores holachas haktores yesh b'tores havodas halacha v'aktora kizrika u'kaktores komets hamincha. So we have 4 stages in the avoda of the ktores. We start with chafina, then we go to kabbalah. From the mole chafnov, it goes into the kaf, and that's called kabbalah, like kabbalah sadam. And then he's molech the ktores, which has the Torah and the category of holacha. And finally, the Torah, which is parallel to Zrika Sadam and Haktoras HaKtores. Now, the next piece, which we'll do tomorrow, in Dam, we said that if the Dam falls on the Ritzvah from the Tzavra Behema, it's on the Ritzvah Hazor, it passes the Dam. What about a case of Nishpach in Chafina? If the Torres somehow is dropped onto the Ritzvah. So that's going to be a sugya which we'll talk about in tomorrow.